welcome to The Militaries Are Not Monolithic, using military intra and interactions to add depth to your storyline and your characters. I'm Jim Curtis, and I'll be presenting this today. It's about 30 minutes long. A little bit on my background. I'm a retired naval flight officer, retired defense contractor, and I've got a few books. For background, let's go back and look at the basics of many countries have a variation of the standard model of three basic military branches. That would be the Army, an Air Force, and a Navy. Another number of countries have no Navy for geographic reasons. They're landlocked. Most smaller countries are going to have a single organization, and that's usually going to be an Army or an infantry. For background, I want to start with the U.S. military. That's the one I'm most familiar with. 5 separate services, if you will: the Air Force, the Army, the Navy, the Marine Corps, which is actually a subset of the Navy, and the Coast Guard. All report up a senior service chain to the chairman, the Joint Chiefs, and the Secretary of Defense. Each service has a specific mission. As you can see them listed here, Air Force controls basically the air, the Navy the sea, the Marine Corps an expeditionary or initial fighting force for land, sea, or air as required. The Army is a long-term fight and win by sustaining land dominance, and the Coast Guard ensures our nation's maritime safety, security, and the stewardship, which I'll get into. You'll note that I do not name the Space Force because at this point, they still don't have a mission per se. However, there's always a battle over who controls what, who's in charge of what, and who gets to do what, when, and where. One of the things that I want to mention here, which does play into your writing, is the tooth-to-tail ratio. In other words, that is how many support personnel are required to support one fighter in combat. As you can see, I've done here the AEF in 1918 and Iraq in 2005. Notice the change in headquarters and admin support personnel. I will go into that in a bit more detail later. Now, we're going to look at components. Army, basically 5 components: infantry, armor, air, cavalry, logistics, and odds and sods. The Navy, and I'm going to go fairly detailed on the Navy since that's what I did for 20 years. Ships, submarines, aviation, logistics, odds and sods, and the Marine Corps, which has another list underneath of basically the same things. Air Force, bombers, fighters, missiles, transport, logistics, odds and sods. Coast Guard, ships, aircraft, waterway control, LEO detachments, which are an interesting offshoot. Law enforcement detachments will man Navy ships to perform law enforcement duties, which the Navy, by its construct, are not allowed to do. They also have logistics. They also have odds and sods. Now I'm going to get into a breakdown of the Navy here into its component parts. The CNO, or Chief of Naval Operations, is the overall control for the Navy. As you can see here, I have naval, air, and submarines broken down. And as you can see, it goes quite a bit down a number of steps. For example, fixed wing goes down to MPRA, which is another subset of VPU and VUP. So one of those is a manned platform, one of those is a unmanned platform or a drone. Ships, and they break down into major classes. You have the carriers, the cruiser, destroyer, and frigates, the expeditionary ships, and logistics. And the one that's covered up by my smiling face in the lower right corner is other, which includes ships as small as patrol craft, which have a 6-man crew. To give you an example of the differential, a carrier has around 5,200 people. A cruiser or destroyer will have anywhere from 270 to 350 people. An expeditionary ship will have well over 1,000. If they have Marines on board, that can go up to 2,000. A logistics ship will have 20 to 30 Navy personnel plus civilians. Now let's look at odds and sods. In the Navy, you have personnel, the judge advocate and the inspector general. You have supply. You have spec warcom, which are the SEALs, the special boat units, and the crewmen that man those. You have intel. You have CBs, the people that build things, and you have chaplains. Next is operational control. And this is where you get into your fleets. As you notice, I've laid out 2nd through 10th Fleet and what area of the world they're required to manage. In other components, you're going to have a similar breakdown. Army and Marines, they break down along division, regiment, battalion, and company. And then in each company, they're broken further down to the individual troop. If you want to look these up, you can find those with your search tools. The Air Force breaks down similarly, except everything is by squadron. So you have command, you have the wing, you have a squadron, you have a support squadron, and other cats and dogs. One of the things we always talk about is that every military branch is subject to infighting. This is usually over money. And as a secondary, which component commander is in charge affects where the money goes. In other words, when you have a submariner that is the chief of naval operations, most of the money that comes in by his background or her background, they're going to want to slide that money toward the submarine community. A ship driver is going to do the same thing. They want the money to go to the ships. If it's an Airedale, they're going to want the money to go to aviation. So in big Navy, as we call it, at the upper levels, it's always a fight between the ships, submarine, and aviation for money. In the ships, going down one step, it's the carrier versus the crew des versus expeditionary versus logistics. In aviation, it's a battle between fighter and attack, fixed wing, and helicopters. Submariners are controlled by one admiral, even though you have 3 types of submarines. You have your ballistic missile, your fast attack, and your guided missile submarines. So we don't see the infighting, but it still exists. And that's from friends that have been there and done that battle. Now that we've got that, let's look at other things. The TLAs, 3-letter acronyms. Everybody uses them and everybody hates them. Most people, if you say, what does a CPA mean? They're going to say Certified Public Accountant. If you're in the military and an aviator, or submariner, or ship driver, CPA means closest point of approach. So always make sure when you use a 3-letter acronym, at some point you explain it before you use it. Intra-service fighting is normal and expected. Each component is always going to think they're better than the others. Now, where this gets interesting is when a component or subcomponent gets a new toy. They let everyone else know how proud they are of their new toy, and as we say, that's when the fight started. Now, logistics. Everybody hates logistics for a couple of reasons. Because, I'll go into that more in detail in a later slide. Inter-service fighting is where it gets interesting. The Army hates the Marines first and foremost because by the time the Army gets there, the Marines have already got taken and held ground, and the Army's playing catch-up. The Army also hates the Air Force because the Air Force is their main means of transportation. And the Air Force is always in the dichotomy of, do I carry your stuff or my stuff? The Marines hate the Navy because the Navy is actually their parent command. And they hate the Army because the Army comes in and screws up what they just got through taking. And they don't want the Air Force doing close air support, three-letter acronym, because they don't do it right. And the Air Force hates the Navy because of submarines. Now, you're going to look at that and go, what? The reason for that is the Air Force wanted to control all strategic defense and strategic initiatives, mainly the nuclear. Well, it didn't quite work out that way because the Navy has ballistic missile submarines. So therefore, the Air Force is not in total charge, which pisses them off to this day. And everybody always ignores the Coast Guard until somebody needs rescued. The Coast Guard is a very small organization compared to the other services. But their motto is Semper Paratus, they're always ready. And the rescue people in the Coast Guard have a second motto, if you will. We have to go out, we don't have to come back. And in many cases, they have attempted rescues and not survived them, sadly. Now, some personnel. So now we're getting down to the individual people. Fighter pilots, by and large, are egotistical assholes. Fighter pilots tend to be small, wiry, perfect vision, fast twitch muscles, and they can pull high Gs on a routine basis. They also have big watches and little you-know-whats. And their favorite thing to do is to shoot their watches off in the bar, parenthetically speaking, as they maneuver their hands. And I was doing this, yeah, whatever. Fixed-wing pilots, on the other hand, are laid back and easygoing by and large. They get the job done without drama because they're crew operations, which means that they have to depend on the enlisteds that are also on the airplane with them. Helo pilots, well, that's kind of the definition of twitchy. They fly complicated machines very easily. As we jokingly say, 10,000 parts in a loose formation that the Earth rejects, but they fly them well, and they clank when they walk because they're the ones that go out and do the things that you should not be able to do with helicopters, like rescuing people in the middle of combat. No combat-ready unit has ever passed inspection, and no inspection-ready unit has ever done well in combat. This is true. The picture here is a C-130J landing downrange on a dirt strip. This was a resupply mission in a certain part of the world, and it was successful because these guys came in and did their job, and girls. Ship drivers. COs are God figures when underway. They're frazzled all the time because they never get enough sleep. One of my cohorts, when he was a CO, said in the 2 years he was a CO, he might have gotten 5 hours of sleep a night if he was lucky. They're frazzled all the time, too, because they eat their own young. Any kind of attitude in the surface force is not acceptable. And they hate aviators, especially the ones that land on their boat and make them do things that they don't want to do, like turn into the wind. They also subscribe to the mine is bigger than yours mentality. So the bigger the ship, the bigger the ego. But at the same time, they also must delegate authority to the bridge crew, to Combat Information Center, to the ASW module, or the ballistic missile defense modules. Submariners, again, the God figures. They can literally disappear for months at a time. They have limited communications, and they can pretty much operate anywhere there is water. Sometimes in places that they probably shouldn't operate. If you go back and look at some of the World War II boats, there is one boat that actually blew up a train in Japan. They are sneaky. They also have the mine is more important than yours mentality between your fast attack, your guided missile, and your ballistic missile submarines. By necessity, they also must temporarily designate authority to the specialized qualifications. In the BNs and the GNs, that is to the people that are missile and weapons qualified, and also to the watch teams that stand the watch in the con. Logistics and supply. As I said, I was going to talk about this later. Well, this is later. What the picture you're seeing is a replenishment ship that is getting ready to offload to a carrier and a destroyer simultaneously. It's beans and bullets and fuel. Delivery is sometimes interesting, and this pretty much goes across all the spectrum in that things that have to work together never ever ship together. So you'll get half of what you need, and the other half is somewhere in transit. It's the bane of all the other components. It's derisively known as bean counters. They are the ones that are in charge of who pays for what, when, and where, and who provides delivery. But they control delivery. So this is a part where you can play this in your story. Let's say you have a space force. You have logistics ships that are going to be traveling with your space force. They're going to be the slowest. They're going to be the least armored because all they have is beans and bullets on them. So again, how does that play in? Who does what to protect them? Now let's get to the fun part. The COs, male or female, always have the ultimate responsibility and ultimate accountability for everything that happens on their ship, their submarine, their aircraft, or their spaceship. You can play a little bit now with your differences, the way you set things up, by the book versus chaotic. Air Force, if it's not approved in writing, it's usually not allowed. Navy and Marines, if it's not specifically prohibited, it's good. The Army, yeah, what are these rules you speak of? And these also can be used to configure opposing forces. So you can have one force that's by the book, one that is totally chaotic, or some mix of the two. There's always written versus unwritten rules. How you play these in your story is up to you. Personal insults. Well, let me tell you, folks, having spent 20 years in the military, I've been called a lot of things over the years. But you learn not to take it personally. Because if you're being insulted, that usually means you've been accepted by the group. If the group does not accept you, they are always very formal and polite. And that's when you get worried. Again, byplay with your primary and your secondary characters. Infighting. There's always infighting between the groups. On a carrier, the Airedales, the squadrons that are on board, are always going back and forth with the ship's personnel. Now, you also get actual fighting. Yeah, it happens. People get ticked. I mean, you try living with 5,200 of your closest friends in 12 square feet of space for 6 months at a time and see how well you get along. You also have unplanned interactions, and those can be legion. Just remember, it's always easier to ask for forgiveness than it is to get permission. And you can have fun with that in a storyline, too. Senior enlisted versus officers. Senior enlisteds, by and large, do not think much of junior officers for good reason. They're usually untrained, they're marginally capable, and they need guidance to be able to do their jobs. Also, senior enlisteds of different services will cooperate regardless of what their bosses say. And that can lead to some interesting situations. Secretaries. Everybody tends to denigrate secretaries, but I will tell you for a fact, they can make things happen or not. One example here, I was getting ready to take a couple of aircraft from the west coast of the U.S. to Iceland to do an operation. And I could not get the right security infrastructure in place for those airplanes because the east and west coast use different security measures. And I tried for about 4 days, and I was griping to my secretary about it. The next morning, she had everything done. And I asked her, I said, how did you do that? She says, Oh, I just called the secretary at the place you were going, and oh, she's the admiral's secretary, so she went and talked to the admiral. The admiral said make it happen. I went, thank you, thank you, thank you. So secretaries can either make you or break you. And they make some rather interesting secondary characters too. Odds and sods, mainly in the special missions world, they will either have partnerships or agree to ignore each other. Probably one of the classics was a set of snipers from the Marine Corps and that were set up downrange, and a set of snipers from the Army from one of their special units who were told to go to the same place. So they ended up for about 24 hours taking shifts where the Marines would be on the gun for a while, then the Army would be on the gun for a while, and they went back and forth. So neither one of their bosses ever knew about it until after the fact. You've got the forgotten troops and units. These are your unmanned units. For the Navy, it's the surface vessels, the underwater vessels, and the airborne UAVs, unmanned aerial vehicles. They can play a part depending on how you want to use that. Commonly, what you'll see in most space operas is the drones or the mines or, uh, the hidden assets that just sit out there and nobody knows about. And you can always add a soup can of barracks lawyers. These are people who think they know everything. They know exactly how the military is supposed to run. And by God, they're going to make sure it runs the way they think it should, regardless of whether that's right or wrong. These are the folks who usually end up in significant trouble and usually end up either kicked out or in jail, one or the other. Another thing that you can play with is what's called ROE, or rules of engagement. Rules of engagement determine how a military is going to act as far as its conduct in war. Now, you can have, again, one side can have a very structured ROE. The other side can have no ROE, or they kill everybody ROE. Your choice. You also have allies versus the bad guys. Who are your allies? You see an acronym here, 5I, FYVE. That's known as 5I. That's the 5 countries that the U.S. is most closely allied with. So you can have good guys, bad guys, and some odds set of friends that come to the party with you. Now, where does this all come from? What you have to do as a writer, especially if you're building a space opera, is you have to build your own fleet. You don't need to ever describe it in detail, but it's a good idea to have those components in your head or at least written down. As I've said, supply will always be the slowest and least capable. Weapon and missile availability will scale to the size of the unit. In other words, the huge missiles that you have on your battle cruiser won't work on a destroyer. Also, the availability of the number of them won't work. Fighters can't fight huge ships unless they cross the T, which I'll show on the next slide. Sensors, and I'm talking real world, would not work if they are inside the shielding. So again, that soup can of reality. Time and distance. Do the math. Unless you're going to do hand wavium on how long it takes to get places and do things. There are plenty of things online that can help you to do that math for time distance, but it makes sense. The reality is that human control of a battle is non-existent in space. Why do I say that? Because you're either at standoff distances where you're going to shoot, and then it's up to the computer to either keep you alive or get you killed, one or the other. Also, if it's a knife fight, whatever range you determine to be a knife fight, the battle is going to be over before the human ever realizes what's going on at speed. So the computer would do an automatic sequence and you either survive or die. Also, operational plans, or O plans as we call them, are only good until the first shot is fired in battle. So you always need to have that backup A, B, C, D, down to Z set of plans for when the things go totally south. This is also where you can bring in your secondary characters. You can have a byplay there, any number of things. And even if you're writing space opera, you want to have a modicum of reality. You want to make sure that the various capabilities you give to your units don't counteract each other. Now, I was talking about crossing the T. Crossing the T from in front is a bad idea because that means they can bring all the weapons to bear on you. However, if you're a small ship or a fighter and you can cross the T from the back as shown on the right side, then you could do some significant damage because in the real, I say real world, in your world, in a shielded world, you would not shield your power plant. You would not shield your stern, otherwise the ship would not have any drive capability. So that would have to be open to space. And even a small unit can come in from the rear and at least do a modicum of damage to your drive systems. Again, how you want to play that is up to you. And always remember, join the service, travel to exotic places, meet new people, drink new alcohol, eat new food, catch exotic diseases that aren't all cured by penicillin, and last but not least, try to remember that the natives are actually trying to kill you. If you would like a copy of this presentation, feel free to email me at oldnfo.gmail.com, and I'll be happy to send it to you. And I thank you very much for listening in, if you made it all the way through. And remember, all we can do is give you ideas. What you put on paper is up to you. And hopefully this presentation has at least given you some ideas of how to do things. Thank you very much for watching and have a good day.